is Christopher Vaughn from Alabama Alpha, Athens State University, and he's going to talk to us about the Rubik's Cube in the mathematics classroom.
Good morning, everybody. Whenever I saw the schedule and saw that I went first, I was initially wondering who I had offended. We'll make it through this all right together, right? So, to start off with, some of you may have seen the abstract whenever the initial email went out and went, why in the world the Rubik's Cube? It was the same question that my advisor asked me whenever I proposed this paper to him a little over a year ago now. But whenever I was a kid, I'm a little bit older than many of you that aren't faculty here in the room. I grew up in the 80s, so the Rubik's Cube was the thing. And whenever I was in elementary school, I was one of those kids that had a cube. My teacher kept taking it away from me. Some of you that are a little bit older may be in the same boat that I'm in with that. But the one thing that I was never able to do was actually solve it. I was one of those people, I played with it and played with it and played with it, and I took it apart, and usually my solution involved removing the stickers and putting them back on. And you know, I had cubes that I had taken the stickers off of so many times that stickers would just slide right off and they wouldn't go back together. Or the infamous, a lot of the literature that's about the Rubik's Cube nowadays refers to something known as the screwdriver method, where you take it and you just pop it apart and put it back together. So I imagine that there are a few people in the room that have done that. But whenever I started into the mathematics program at Athens State, I had heard rumored that there was a new project coming about, a larger senior thesis than what had originally been done. So I had started looking around early and trying to decide, well, what thing do I want to research? What do I want to know more about? And I was going through YouTube. Many of you may be familiar with the YouTube channel Numberphile. And I love Brady Haran's videos. And he did a whole series on the Rubik's Cube, and I found myself going, that's cool. I like that. So I found myself doing more and more research. My own children kind of got interested in it, and we started going through it. And then I finally decided, you know what? I want to do this. So what we're going to do today is just kind of a brief overview of some of the research that I found and some things that I kind of learned along the way from my research. So we'll talk about the history a little bit first. Take just a quick look at where the cube came from and how it became the world's most popular puzzle. So Erno Rubik is he was an instructor at the Academy of Applied Arts and Crafts in Budapest. He had grown up in Hungary. He was born shortly after the end of World War II. And as he grew up, he was always fascinated with math. He was always fascinated with geometry. But even by his own admission, he wasn't that good at it. So whenever it came time for him to go to college, he studied more in design and architecture and was more concerned about form than he was really the mathematics behind things. But whenever he became an instructor himself, he was teaching descriptive geometry and design, and he had students that were having a hard time kind of wrapping their head around symmetry and rotation and really trying to understand how you go from a two-dimensional form on paper to what that really means in a three-dimensional world. So he was trying to figure out, how do you make this make sense? So the whole idea for the cube came from the fact that he wanted to find a way to explain something better to his students. So initially the cube started off as a series of paper cubes that he just kind of stacked together and then would rotate them and put them together. Eventually he was like, this just doesn't do what I want it to do. And the first version of the cube was created. It's actually the 40th anniversary of the cube. It was in 1974 whenever he first did the first prototype, and that's what you see here. Looks a little bit different than what you recognize today as your regular standard Rubik's Cube. But with the wood, he marked it with paint and paper, and he did a few things to try to figure out a way to get it to hold together. The first prototype here was held together with a series of rubber bands. You can imagine how that went together. Eventually you twist and you turn and it falls apart. He tried magnets. Eventually you would turn it to where you had the same pole together and it falls apart. So he worked on it. It became a project that he worked on with some of his students in his classes. And eventually the mechanism that's inside most cubes today was developed. So this mechanism, the whole thing hinges really on those springs and those screws. Everything screws together in that center cross piece, and it allows for just enough movement for it to separate enough to rotate, but it holds it together firmly enough where it doesn't fall apart in your hand. So you'll notice in the presentation there'll be a few quotes along the way. And the thing that struck me is in a lot of the interviews that I read and transcripts that I read from things where Rubik taught, he would always go back to, I wanted to make it perfect. And he kept working on it. He wanted to make it better. And this was his perfect design. So this design from 1974 came to be mass-produced by what was then the Seven Towns toy company, a toy company in Europe. And they started marketing it as the Magic Cube or the Hungarian Magic Cube. Over the course of the next couple of years, the popularity grew, and even though he lived in communist Hungary, he was being urged by people to market and sell more and more. And eventually Seven Towns sold a license to the Ideal Toy Company in 1980 to market the cube. And by the end of 1980, it was the toy of the year. And it started spreading like wildfire. I'd like to point out here on the bottom of the sticker, it says over 3 billion combinations, one solution. That's the biggest understatement of all of the research that I did. We'll get to that here in a second. So Ideal starts marketing it. The popularity explodes. Cube solving groups show up everywhere. The first cube solving group in the US was at MIT in the fall of 1980. So today, it's grown and grown. There are versions of the cube, and now there's even an app for that. You can go to the App Store, you can download it, and you can sit and work the cube without even having to have one in your hand. There's version after version. There's cubes of all different sizes and dimension. So now we move on from here. That's kind of the background. Now, let's talk a little bit about the actual math and kind of go back into, well, how can we use this in our classroom? One of the things that you may find is that if you Google the Rubik's Cube, there's a lot of times there's a relationship to group theory. And for the longest time, the group theory page in Wikipedia actually had a picture of a cube, that one is there, on the page. So the interesting thing is, Rubik himself, whenever he first built it, he couldn't solve it. He says it took him over a month. There are people that were friends with him at the time said it took him 6 months. He said he was able to do it in a little over a month. And to begin with, he didn't think that it was actually possible to do this. You know, the way that most of us feel when we pick one up now. So he said, but for me, it was a code that I myself had invented, yet I couldn't read it. And I don't know about you, but that's the way that I felt about group theory and abstract algebra. Because again, I'm a little older than most of you guys, and that kind of stuff was never taught to me whenever I was in high school, and I just went, really? I'm lost. So, we'll all recall back from that abstract class, there's a few things that we have to say for sure and for certain before we can say that something is a group. So, first thing, we have to have closure. So no matter what I do to this cube here, no matter how I turn it, I can't change the elements of this cube. It's always going to be these cubes, this order. There's nothing I can do that I can turn this and suddenly I have a purple side. So we have a closure, we have a closed set. We have an identity, and this is kind of, some of you are going to go, really? But our identity is if we do nothing, or if we do a move and then do nothing, we have the same thing. It's kind of a stretch, I'll admit, but hey, it works here. So the next thing we have is we have to have some inverses. We have to have a way to go back. So for every move that we have, there is a sequence of moves, or a move that will return us to the position where we started. Now, I will freely admit that my associativity proof here is a little weak, right? But if you actually look in the literature, what it takes to actually prove associativity in here is a 20-minute talk unto itself. It's pretty long and involved. We all understand that we can change the order of operations, the specific operations, but we end up at the same result. But for the sake of this talk, without going into too much detail, it does, in fact, every permutation has a sequence that results in it being another permutation of the cube. These permutations form a group, and groups, by definition, have associativity. So yes, that is a circular argument to say that it has associativity because it has associativity. But hey, it's a long, drawn-out thing here. So, with this, the axioms are met that the Rubik's Cube forms a group. So, with that, we can also begin to talk a little bit about the permutations. So, with the permutations, the easiest way to talk about it here is if you look, if we take right behind that box, apparently you have a mouse cursor on this, and I keep touching it. Okay, so if we flatten it out and we label our individual squares with a number, then we can talk about what is in this original, this first table here. And this first table represents a quarter turn of a particular face, whether it's the upper, the up, the down, left, front, right, back. That's how we're labeled here. And as you do a quarter turn, how the positions of those numbers will change and how those cycles work. So whenever we do that, it works for a little bit for those particular faces. But then we get to something where something like a Cayley diagram works a little bit better and explains it a little better, because you can see how we go from one to the other, and whenever we turn or twist, we see how we can go from one piece to the other. But again, this only goes so far, and then you start expanding, and pretty soon you get to something that's really complicated, and this doesn't even scratch the surface of how you go from one permutation to the other. It becomes a larger and larger web, and it gets kind of unmanageable. So the reason it becomes unmanageable is there's so many combinations. There's so many permutations of the cube. Well, how many of them are there? So if we go through and we look, we'll ask how many permutations of the standard cube are there? So first off, our center positions. The middle pieces never move. They never change position in relationship to each other, so we don't count them. There's one set, this is it. It's not going to change. Green is always going to be opposite of blue. Red's always going to be opposite of orange. They're never going to change position. However, we have 8 corner pieces with 8 factorial positions and 3 to the 8th different orientations. So it can be in the 8 different positions, and you can turn it the different ways. The edge pieces, we have 12 factorial positions and 2 to the 12th orientations. And that explodes to a ridiculously large number. That thing's huge. So what we end up with, that huge number isn't quite the number we're looking for. We have a problem because there are different orbits. Because if you start changing orientations of the cube, what you'll end up with is you'll create an entirely different universe of solutions. So if I take this edge piece and I pull it off and turn it, I've created all of those solutions over again. So there are 12 of these orbits. So we divide it off here, and we still, even after we divide it by 12, have a ridiculously large number. So to kind of give you a perspective of how large this number is, this cube is 57 millimeters in every direction. We take this cube, put it with one cube in every permutation, set it in the orbit of the Earth around the sun. It goes around the sun 46 times. It's a lot. I'd originally done in my previous presentation showed the world record. The current world record is 5.55 seconds. And at that world record pace, it would take hundreds of thousands of years to solve every permutation of the cube, even at that wild and ridiculous pace. So we have an enormous amount of possible permutations. So we have something that leading into that is we have something known as the God's number. And that's whenever you have a puzzle like this, what is the least amount of moves that it will take to solve it? What's the furthest that that cube can be from being solved? And on a side note, this is one of the former world record holders for a piece of artwork made entirely out of Rubik's cubes, and it was about the size of this wall. So how do we find God's number? Well, there was a team in 2010 that actually put together the solution. Morley Davidson and John Dethridge led a team that put together a computer program to prove what that number was. So whenever they're trying to prove this, the only way to do it is proof by exhaustion. And I don't know if you noticed that number, that's a lot of cases to go through. So what they did is they paired off the different solutions, shrunk it down into manageable sets, and went, well, effectively this is the same as this. It's the same color pattern, just with different colors. So they were able to partition groups off and go, okay, this is the set that we have to look at in order to solve this. So whenever you have a big question like this, how do you find your answer? Well, they did what the rest of us have done, and they Googled it. Literally. They took their program and they ran it on the mainframe at Google. And Google, being a company full of benevolent nerds, chose to allow them to run their program and find what this is. And eventually, after the equivalent of about 35 years of processor time, they found that the number is actually 20. No matter what I do to this cube, it's never more than 20 moves from being solved. So, with that being the case, which was mind-blowing to me that you could narrow it down that far. So now we are back to our original thing. It was used in the classroom, so let's go back to the classroom real quick. So again, Rubik said he was always passionate about geometry and the study of three-dimensional form. So how does this apply to our current modern educational system classrooms? In the primary grades, we can put cubes in kids' hands to help them identify and describe shape, distinguish between defining attributes of shapes, and reason with shapes and their attributes. Those are directly from the national standards for your primary grades. Again, for the elementary grades, we're reasoning with shapes, draw and identify lines and angles, classify shapes by properties, understand concepts of volume and relate volume to multiplication and division. It's a cube that's pre-divided into smaller cubes, into a unit. What better tool can you put in a kid's hand that doesn't understand volume than something that's subdivided into a unit of volume? So, in the middle grades, we start solving real-world problems. We can represent, analyze, generalize patterns, tables, graphs. We can start using symbolic logic. In our secondary grades, we go on, we start problem solving using the reasoning and proof We can communicate how we solve this problem to each other. We can make connections to other things. We can represent things with models. Post-secondary, the list, it's just a huge list here of applications for this in a classroom. This is still used in computer programming classrooms. I believe it's at the Naval Academy where one of the authors that I read a lot of his research was David Joyner. He uses the Rubik's Cube to teach advanced math at the Naval Academy. So the applications just go on and on and on. But he found that it was impossible to put the thing down. And I found the same thing. And I've given students in my internship, I've given them the cube, and I have these moments where they have those flashes and those ahas. And they're fighting through and they're solving problems. They won't do a math problem, but they'll fight through and solve this problem. And I may be giving up too soon, but I'm calling it a win. And every now and then, we can go from this without turning into that. But, in closing, what can one teacher do? A good puzzle is a fair thing, and nobody's lying, and it's very clear that the problem depends just on you. Again, this man was a teacher, like many of us in this room are going to be or currently are. And what I have learned is I've come to respect him not just as an inventor, not just as a designer, but I've come to respect him as an educator because he woke up one morning and went, there's got to be a better way. And he went, and this was what he found to be his better way. And he didn't set out to create what became the world's most popular toy, what's the most popular puzzle in history. He set out to explain something to his students. And in doing so, what he found was something that changed the world. Those business leaders he worked with in Hungary became the leaders of the revolution that brought democracy to their country. The people that he worked with, he said, me and my capitalist friends, because of my invention, were able to bring the government to its knees. The man changed his world because he was dedicated to making his students better. And that's what I would like to leave you with this morning, is to remember that whenever you hit that point where you're like, I'm not going to make a difference here, you can. Because one person can change the world by changing their classroom. Thank you.